The last buggy had already rolled away. The dishes had stopped. The older women were gone. The lanterns were low, and the house had gone quiet in that particular way it only does after something big has ended. I was still in my dress. My scalp hurt from the pins. My feet were done. My smile had been gone for hours. And I wasn't thinking about the vows. I wasn't thinking about the sermon, the food, or the 100 people who watched me become somebody's wife. I was thinking about one closed door. Because on the night I got married, after all the waiting, all the rules, all the talk about doing things the right way, nobody told me I still couldn't touch my own husband. Not the way I thought I finally could. Nobody warned me that the first 3 nights of my marriage would be spent alone, lying awake in a room that didn't feel like mine anymore, listening for footsteps that weren't allowed to come.
If you've never heard of this before, stay with me. What sounds like one more small religious rule turns into something much heavier once you understand what those 3 nights were actually doing. It wasn't about waiting. It was about control. It was about fear. And by the time the waiting ended, the so-called special night everyone kept whispering about didn't feel romantic. It felt like a test I hadn't agreed to take. The wedding itself was exactly what you'd expect in the strictest plain communities. Long, formal, public in every way except the ways that mattered. Hours of ceremony. Hard benches. Sermons about obedience and duty and marriage as sacred covenant. Then the meal. Then the greetings. Then more people, more hands, more smiles, more older women looking at you with that expression that says, without saying anything, now your real life begins. And underneath all of it, there was one private thought I kept coming back to all day. Tonight, finally, we'll be alone. That was the small flame I carried through the whole thing. Because when you grow up somewhere, touch is regulated, where privacy barely exists, where courtship is watched, where feelings are something you hide behind careful words and lowered eyes. Marriage isn't just a milestone. It's supposed to be the moment the wall comes down, the moment the distance ends, the moment 2 people stop performing restraint and actually belong to each other without someone watching, correcting, judging. That's what I thought was on the other side of the day. Instead, when the house emptied and the relatives finally left and the whole day narrowed to one simple question, where do we go now? The answer wasn't what I expected. Not together. Separately. In stricter districts, that first stretch after the wedding was treated almost like an extension of everything that came before it. The vows being spoken didn't mean the gates flew open. Purity and self-control were still expected to govern everything. And the waiting period got dressed up as spiritual caution, moral preparation, seriousness. But when you're standing in your wedding dress after 12 hours of performing happiness for everyone else, it doesn't feel serious. It feels mean. I remember the moment I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. I thought maybe I'd gotten it wrong. Maybe they meant just for a little while. Maybe until the house settled. Maybe because relatives were still nearby. But then it was explained in that calm, practiced tone people use when they're telling you something they've already decided you have no right to question. 3 nights. 3 nights apart. 3 nights to prove discipline. 3 nights to keep the beginning of the marriage clean. 3 nights to approach what was supposed to be serious, not rushed. And I remember thinking, I'm sorry, what exactly have we been waiting for? Nobody says that part out loud. Because publicly, the language is always reverent, purity, restraint, order. But privately, what a lot of women feel is confusion sitting on top of humiliation. You've spent your whole life being told not to want too much, feel too much, say too much. Then on the one day you're finally allowed to cross that line, they move it. And suddenly you're a wife who still has to stand in the hallway asking permission. The first night was the worst because hope was still alive. Hope makes the quiet louder. I lay there and listened to the house settling. A board creaked. Someone coughed. Dishes clattered somewhere far off. Wind hit the side of the house, and every sound made me think, maybe this is the moment. Maybe someone comes back and says there's been a mistake. Nobody came. What I remember most from that night isn't sadness, it's embarrassment. I felt embarrassed for expecting tenderness, embarrassed that wanting closeness somehow made me foolish or weak or impure. That's what rules like these do. They take something ordinary and human, and they turn it into something you start policing inside yourself. You feel ashamed not because you've done anything wrong, but because you wanted something before the system was ready to hand it to you. Mourning was worse. Getting married doesn't buy you privacy in a community like that. The next day, life just comes back. People return, chores, cleanup, visiting. Some people tease, others go quiet. And the older women give you those sideways looks, the ones from women who know exactly what you're going through and have decided that surviving it is the same thing as endorsing it. That's how traditions like this keep going, by the way, not just through rules, through people who were hurt by something and then decided it must have been meaningful. Through phrases like, it's only a few days, or you'll understand later, or that's just how it's done. The second night was different. The first night had disbelief in it. The second night had nothing, just loneliness. I'd seen him during the day, which made it worse. We were married, and yet every glance felt dangerous. Standing near him felt charged. Even ordinary conversation felt strange because there was this huge unsaid thing between us. We both knew what was being held back. We both knew every hour was making it heavier. And nobody around us thought that was a problem. Some of them seemed to think that was exactly the point. Because the waiting didn't just delay things, it rewired them. It packed everything with pressure and suspense and expectation. The community didn't need to be in the room. They'd already built the room inside your head. That's the thing about systems like this. They don't have to enforce every moment directly. They just have to make you carry the rule yourself. By the second night, I'd stopped imagining anything good and started dreading the end of the waiting. That probably sounds strange if you've never been in that position, but think about it. If you've had no honest preparation, if sex has only ever come up in warnings or whispers or vague moral language, if physical closeness has been treated as dangerous but too shameful to discuss plainly, then waiting doesn't make things easier. It makes them monstrous. It makes the whole thing loom. It turns what should be a first step between two people who care about each other into a performance that everyone silently scheduled for you. That's a terrifying thing to walk toward. By the third day, the exhaustion was quiet, the kind that empties your thoughts out. I'd smiled until my face felt like someone else's. I'd accepted congratulations from people who would never ask how I actually was. I'd moved through rooms as a new person, wife, grown woman, married daughter, while still feeling suspended, unfinished, like I'd been declared transformed without ever being allowed to arrive anywhere. That's the real damage of a tradition like this. It stalls the transition while pretending to bless it. Instead of giving two people room to start their life together, gently, privately, awkwardly, honestly, it drags out the threshold until the threshold becomes the whole story. It tells them anticipation matters more than comfort. That discipline matters more than tenderness. That being ready in the community's eyes matters more than feeling safe with each other. Some people inside these worlds will defend it. Some will say it made the eventual night feel more serious, more meaningful. But meaningful and painful aren't opposites. Something can stay with you because it left marks in the wrong places. On the third night, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized I didn't feel like a bride anymore. I felt like someone walking toward an exam they hadn't studied for and couldn't leave. Because underneath all the sacred language, what had been building wasn't intimacy. It was dread. a fear of failing at something nobody had ever clearly defined. Would I know what to do? Would he? What if it hurt? What if it was awkward? What if I panicked? What if after all this wait and waiting and mystery, it wasn't beautiful at all? Nobody had answers, just expectations. An expectation, when it moves into a marriage before trust does, causes real damage. This is the part people on the outside miss. They hear about strange traditions, and they focus on whether it sounds old-fashioned or dramatic. But the rule is almost never the real story. The real story is what the rule does to a person's nervous system, what it teaches a young woman about her body, what it teaches a young man about closeness, what it does to two people who might genuinely care about each other but have been denied the language, the privacy, and the ease to start well. Intimacy isn't just permission, it's safety. And if the first lesson of a marriage is that even now your longing is being managed for you, even now someone else sets the pace, even now your most private threshold still belongs partly to tradition, then marriage doesn't start as freedom. It starts as supervision with a holier face. When the waiting ended, I can't give you a soft landing. I wish I could. That would be easier. But what happened was that everything that should have unfolded naturally came at once. Relief, fear, pressure, hope, shame, tenderness, panic, love, maybe. Love trying to breathe under the weight of everyone else's script. That's why this matters to talk about. Not because it's unusual, not because it makes a good headline, but because it shows how a community can reach into the most private parts of a person's life and still call it virtue. A waiting period like this doesn't just delay a wedding night. It takes what should belong to two people and turns it into the final scene of someone else's moral lesson. It tells the bride that even now, at her own threshold, she's safest when she's restrained. It tells the groom that desire is something to control first and understand later, and never really talk about at all. That's why it leaves a mark. Not the 3 nights themselves, what the 3 nights say. They say your body can be joined to someone while your feelings are still being held at arm's length. They say purity, once turned into a system, doesn't know when to stop. They say sometimes the loneliest part of a marriage isn't later, when love goes cold. Sometimes it's right at the start. Sometimes it's the moment everyone else calls holy. Sometimes it's lying in a bed on your wedding night, listening to a quiet hallway, wondering why being a wife still feels so much like being forbidden. If that lands heavy, it should, because the real question isn't just why would they do that? It's what happens to people when tenderness is always made to wait for permission. That question stays, long after the wedding meal is cleared, long after the dress is folded away, long after the whispers about purity stop sounding holy and start sounding like wait, long after those 3 nights are over. If stories like this are why you're here, subscribe. We're just getting started, and the next one is not something you want to miss.